Mr. Gindo Tampubolon, Pak Anu, Pak Muhtar, Mr. Quentin Johnson, Mr. Yoshiyuki Shimura, Mr. Sinya Kawai, Ms. Kazuko Ogasahara. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My colleagues, peers, researchers, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the things that I think you should think carefully if you are dealing with nutrition challenge in Indonesia and respond adequately. And colleagues who are joining us online, thank you for coming and joining us. And I know one from TNP2K is on his way to this place as well, and I welcome him, Pak Elan Satriawan. So it is a great pleasure, first of all, to finally meet you after 2 years of online meeting. There is no substitute for touching flesh. And thank God you are all safe. You survived COVID. I do too. And I hope, by God's grace, we continue our journey together to respond to the challenges that nutrition face in Indonesia, especially the spatial disparity. What I'm going to do today is to lift your eyes, expand your horizon, so that you can see clearly the challenges that you are facing. It is much more than you have thought so far. Nutrition challenges in Indonesia is not only about stunting. If you leave this room with that understanding, I would have achieved my purpose. If you leave this room and still think that nutrition challenges in Indonesia is only stunting, then I have failed. And around this room, there are colleagues from ADB, from BAPPENAS, from the Ministry of Health, from TNP2K, from the universities, all throughout Indonesia. They are your colleagues to tackle adequately the challenges. So we work together, appreciating the task ahead and succeeding in doing that. So, I'm based at Manchester and Helsinki. Some of you may have met me before. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. I was here because of some of the work that we did before, alluded to by Mr. Gindo Tampubolon earlier, that the problem or the challenge of nutrition is not only about undernutrition, but also about overnutrition. I wrote The Double Burden of Malnutrition in Indonesia, where the incidence of simultaneous undernutrition and overnutrition is observed in any unit. And there are quite a few of that in Indonesia. Next, please. But there is another definition of double burden of malnutrition, which focuses on one of this only the undernutrition, because it reduces productivity and simultaneously increases the risk of non-communicable diseases. So these two pair qualifies it as a double burden of malnutrition. And the World Bank has studied this. You can find out more about it. Next, please. Next, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. If you want to read more about it, the double burden of malnutrition as an instance of over and undernutrition, you can get there. Next, please. What we found in this is that in Indonesia, there is a huge disparities across provinces and across kabupaten and kota in the incidence and prevalence of double burden of malnutrition. Being together in this nation of more than 70 years of independence did not deliver uniform, comparable, fair. Instead, we have spatial disparities that persist. And that's a big problem. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. Now, you cannot ignore this because there are some biological consequences of undernutrition that I'm sure people around this room and our online audience are deeply appreciative of. Namely, it is not short term, it is long term. Yeah? It influences cognition, for instance, 20 years down the road. And if it influences cognition 20 years down the road, it influences all other whole outcomes. Yeah? Earnings or productivity. Yeah? And even marriage may matter. Yeah? So, next please. So, I listed a number of those consequences there, and I'm not going to read them to you. Those are not exhaustive lists. Those are just some of the lists that we have come across. We have provided evidence that stunting is a major problem, not only now, but much later, not only one dimension, but many dimensions. I hope this opens up an understanding that stunting or malnutrition or double burden of malnutrition has a life course character. Life course means, next please. Next please. Next please. Next please. It has a life course character. Yeah? Next please. Life consists of many stages, and malnutrition is classic, is typical, is epitomic in a sense that what happens in the early stage in life matters, consequential for later stage in life. That's basically what life course is. So childhood matters for adulthood, and my main work shows it matters for elderhood. I'll show you a little bit of evidence later on from 28 countries around the world, rich countries that I'm talking about, that their childhood matter until they are 100 years old. Matters for their depression, matters for their episodic memory, matters for their muscle dysfunction. Next, please. So this is 28 countries. From America, Britain, Switzerland, Sweden, all sorts. The point that I'm trying to say here, I look at cognitions or episodic memory. In all countries, you can see two lines, red and green. Red is never good except you are Manchester United fans like I am. Green is always good, especially if you're a fan of the Ministry of Health. So the red ones tells you those are Americans, Britons, Swedish people, Finnish people who were poor when they were a child. And you can see their lines are below the green ones. You can see their episodic memory is worse than those who were not poor during childhood. And I look at them until 100 years old. So what happens during childhood matters 9 decades later in rich countries. More likely than not in Indonesia, it will pan out the same. Next, please. This is depression. Can you see the red ones? Is it above or below the green ones? Above. So those who were childhood poor when they were 10 years old, 9 decades later, they have a higher probability of being more depressed. 9 decades later. So life course matters. Stunting during childhood matters. So you are all doing great things if you can tackle stunting. Things that you tackle now rewards you 9 decades later. What kind of work gives you that satisfaction? Very little. Yeah? So if you can tackle stunting in Indonesia, you can tap yourself in the back that you are doing worthwhile, great things. So you should all be excited. Next thing. Now, I did say that I want to lift your gaze up and I want to expand your horizon. This is not something that you ever heard before. This is something beyond your control mostly. But this has a bearing of malnutrition problem in Indonesia, climate change, the warming of our planet. Next, please. So I look at years and years of NASA's observations in order to find out the temperature all throughout Indonesia and rainfall all throughout Indonesia, 13,000 islands in Indonesia. And I checked every single pregnant mother in Susanas 2019 to 2020. And I checked every single day when they were pregnant and where they were. And I checked their temperature and rainfall in order to find out whether indeed, if they were exposed to extreme climate shocks, their infants, the fetus, would be affected. Does that make sense? Yeah? Do you want to know that? Yeah? No? Next, please. So here's what happened. So the probability of giving normal birth, 3 kilograms, 2.5 kilograms and above, the probability of giving normal birth reduced when pregnant mothers were exposed to extreme weather. Yeah? Because the fetus received less oxygen, less nutrients, and therefore they were born with low birth weight. That's what climate change does to Indonesia. That's beyond your control, but you need to know that so that you can prepare pregnant mothers. I want to lift your gaze and expand your horizon. This is something that you should care about. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. So this is something that you are familiar with, the child malnutrition. Yeah? So infants, pregnant mothers, giving birth, this is the next stage in life. Yeah? Up to 5 years. Okay? Life course, different stages. So what's happening here? Next, please. I use the Indonesia Family Life Survey over 22 years. And I also use many rounds of Susanas. Next, please. For those of you, these are the variables. You are familiar with it. Next, please. So, on child malnutrition, stunted, yeah? I follow them when they were stunted. I still follow them 22 years later. Because I do want to know whether those who were stunted compared to those who were normal, they were more depressed or not. Yeah? And what did it say? Depression probability increases 22 years later if they were stunted when they were a child, controlling for a whole of other things. Yeah? So stunting now matters for mental health 22 years later in Indonesia. I did show it for 28 rich countries in the world, but in Indonesia, it matters. Yeah? Next, please. If you want to know a little bit more detail, across social or economic status, across incomes, you look at it on the horizontal axis, yeah? Telling the same story. Next, please. This is the effect not on depression, but on intelligent quotients. This is the effect on executive functions, Raven's matrix test. I'm pretty sure some of you have taken this intelligence test where they give you lots of pictures that you don't know the tail and the end of it, and you try to pick randomly. Yeah, this is that. And it shows that if during childhood they were stunted, 22 years later, they didn't know the answer. Yeah? So it does matter, not only for depression, but also on cognition. Next, please. If you want to know a little bit more details about the functions of cognitions shaped by childhood stunting, that's your picture. Yeah? Next, please. Now, we've looked at depression, we've looked at cognition. We also want to look at whether they make more money or less money when they enter the labor market, or productivity. Yeah? Same story. If they were stunted when they were 5 years old, 22 years later, their wages, their earnings were lower. So not only depression, cognition, but also productivity. So you are all working on something really important. If you tackle stunting, you can improve their depression, their mental health, you can improve their cognitions, their episodic memory and IQ, you can improve their earnings. Yeah? I hope you're all excited now. Next, please. Next, please. I'm not going to go into more detail, except to say, having estimated the effect of stunting on productivity, one summary measure of productivity that all of you are familiar with is the gross developed domestic product, GDP. Yeah? So this is the conservative estimate, the effect of stunting or malnutrition on the GDP of this country. 1.4%. Had Indonesia tackled stunting 20 years ago, your GDP would have improved by 1.4%. Now, it doesn't make any sense to you. It means it's equivalent to more than 1,000 type C, 100 beds, hospitals throughout Indonesia. It is equivalent to 3 new hospitals. Each hospital has 100 beds for each kabupaten. Imagine, during the past 2 years, during COVID, if you had 3 new hospitals in each kabupaten, could you not have tackled COVID better? Yes. That's the problem when you ignore stunting. And from now on, you should eliminate it. Next, please. So, I looked at one of the challenges, namely the spatial disparity. One way of looking at it from science perspective is we look at the odds ratio. Some of you are familiar with odds ratio. Yeah? The odds ratio of men versus women. The odds ratio of a family with a male head and a family with female head. You are all familiar with that, I'm sure. Of course, because I trained you. I have a reputation to keep. If you still don't understand it, come to me, okay? Well, Takashi-san has kindly gave me money to train you all, so you should understand odds ratio. Yeah? So this is the odds ratio of cross kabupaten and kota. And it does show that even after controlling for a whole host of things, the odds ratio is still significant and more than 1. Namely, there is still contextual, spatial differences across Indonesia that is, in the English words, in the National Health Service terms, that is unwarranted variation. Matikan dulu teleponnya itu, Pak. Sudah dibilang cucunya. Teleponnya nanti aja. Sudah? Ya, alhamdulillah. If in the UK, if we have variations across districts that is too high, we call it unwarranted or unwanted variation. And we will call the head of the city council what is going on in your place. And this is the same here. Okay? Yeah, next please. Next please. You are all familiar with this. This is weight for age and height for age distribution in Indonesia. That's the histograms in light green. And the distributions for the world. That's the smooth line. Are you familiar with that? Yeah? You're familiar with that? You must have seen it because I trained you. Yeah? What you may not know is that Indonesia up to now focused on the wrong part of this. Yes? You are all misguided. Can you all see what's going on? Let me do it in a number of ways. One way to look at it is all the distributions of Indonesia is to the left of the normal, the standard, the world. In other words, let me see whether you can quickly get it. Do you have a stunting problem or do you have a wholesale problem? Yeah, wholesale problem. Yeah? So if you focus only on stunting, are you focusing on the right thing? No. You don't have a stunting problem. You do have a nutrition problem. If you go home and get that message, I'm a happy man. You should be different from everybody else in Indonesia because you've come this morning. Your problem is not stunting. Jangan cuma manggut-manggut. So if you want to bring only the stunted children, that's not enough. That's not enough. Can you see that? Next, please. Next, please. So to sum it up for you, I compare the world and Indonesia. The world is on the first column. Some of you may have known percentile or decile. You heard that? Percentile of a distribution? Yeah? Okay, if not, let me tell you. So percentile, the first percentile must be 1%. Yeah? Or the first decile must be 10%. Yeah? That's the standard, that's the normal, that's expected. If, however, you're not 10% in the decile, maybe you should ask questions. Yeah? So let us look from the bottom up. What do we see? Below 1%, yeah? below 1%, namely the first percentile, should be how many? 1%. But in fact, how many Indonesians are in the below 1%? How many? Nearly 20% of Indonesia is at the bottom 1%. How about the top 10%? In the top 10%, you should be how many? 10%. How many were you in the top 10%? 7. Is it a good thing? No. You do not have a stunting problem. You have a nutrition problem throughout the whole distribution. And if you want Indonesia in 2045 to be a sustainable middle-income country, you have your task here. Next, please. Next, please. I'm not going to go through this because I know you are all tired already, but you get the message. Next, please. So, I'm going to show a number of this, the purpose of which is to identify districts at the top and at the bottom so that you can work with them a little bit more effectively. That's the whole idea of this, okay? I trained you to do this. If you forgot it, don't worry. It is quite sophisticated. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, next. Now, yeah. I have shown you infants, mothers and infants, babies, yeah? I've shown you children, yeah? Now I'm going to show you adults. This is part of the FAO, Sustainable Development Goals 121, yeah? Adult nourishment, okay? And the other Sustainable Development Goals, 122, is household food insecurity. I did promise you that I will lift your gaze and expand your horizon. This is part of the expansion, from infants to childhood to adults, yeah? So, next please. Next please. Here it is, yeah? On adult nourishment in Indonesia, there is a huge disparities. There are many kabupaten and kota at the very unwarranted variation top and at the bottom of unwanted variation. Did you see my point earlier? Yeah? So it's not only one, it's not only two. Dozens of districts and provinces in Indonesia cannot secure adult nourishments for all their residents. And where are those kabupaten and kota? Those were the kabupaten and kota that crosses the red lines. Those were unwarranted variation and unwanted variation. You may want to work with them together to secure adult nourishment in those kabupaten and kota, to secure enough productivity in those kabupaten and kota, because without nourishment, they cannot produce to their maximum potential. Are you with me? Next, please. Next, please. So this is family insecurity, the same idea, yeah? So I've worked with infants, I've worked with a child, I've worked with adults, now I work with the whole family. This is family food security, yeah? This is Sustainable Development Goals 122, yeah? Next, please. Next, please. Again. Ini kok tempelan begini, minta dulu mic-nya. Udah mau jatuh ini. There's only sticky tape here, folks, so it falls anytime. So, on food security, I look at all households in Indonesia. Yeah? And same story. There is a huge spatial disparity. There are some kabupaten and kota cannot secure food for their households. And those are kabupaten and kota which cross the red line above and below. Those were unwarranted variations. Those were unwanted variations. So I hope by now you see the scale of the task if you want to ensure nutrition for Indonesia, from pregnant mothers, their infants, their children, when they grow up as adults, and as a family together. Next, please. So a summary, you can see the magnitude, the size of this unwanted variation across kabupaten and kota, which will help you to target which one you want to go after first, because you do not have all the time in the world and the money in the world. Evidence like this helps you to prioritize which ones to target. I am not going to tell you. These are the estimates. Next, please. So, let me conclude. Indonesia does have a nutrition problem, not only a stunting problem. And by now, I hope you can see there are huge variations across kabupaten and kota. And I'm very encouraged to see so many representatives from all the different provinces, from Aceh, I shake hands earlier, and Nusa Tenggara. And I am very hopeful that together we can tackle this. Thank you very much.